Boa tarde a todos. É com alegria que continuamos hoje com o ciclo de Inglês Acadêmico da Aucani, Agência USP de Cooperação Nacional e Internacional, que está orientado não somente para a atualização de professores e alunos de inglês, mas também para todos os autodidatas das diferentes áreas que querem melhorar sua comunicação em língua inglesa para suas diversas finalidades acadêmicas. Para aqueles que continuam nos acompanhando nesse ciclo e aos que participam hoje pela primeira vez, meu nome é Izarra, sou diretora adjunta da Aucani, e em nome de nosso presidente, professor Valmor Tricoli, agradeço a presença virtual de todos nesses webinários que se realizam graças ao apoio da Embaixada dos Estados Unidos e do Consulado Geral em São Paulo, dentro de seu programa English Language Specialist Program of U.S. State Department e do Regional English Language Office. A Aucani-Idiomas oferece cursos gratuitos em línguas estrangeiras para as diferentes finalidades acadêmicas. Consultem então nosso site. Nós esperamos. Hoje, a professora especialista Jamila Barton, do Georgia State University e do programa do Departamento de Estado dos Estados Unidos, demonstrará como consultar o Corpus of Contemporary American English, o COCA, que permite não somente aprimorar a escrita acadêmica em inglês, mas também pesquisar os usos de língua inglesa nas diversas áreas. Mais de 200 universidades do mundo consultam o COCA. A licença para o uso do English Corpora foi adquirido pelo curso de inglês do Departamento de Letras Modernas da Faculdade de Filosofia, Letras e Ciências Humanas da USP e está à disposição de toda a comunidade USP dentro e fora do campus. Nós vamos anunciar e deixar registrado o link para que vocês possam também acessá-lo. Switching into English then, I welcome you all to the third webinar of the University of São Paulo International Cooperation Academic Office within its program of internationalization at USP. I pass on to my colleague, Professor Luciana Carvalho Fonseca, who is the Pedagogical Coordinator at Aucani-Idiomas and responsible for this important project of academic English. She will introduce you to this third webinar and to Professor Jamila Barton. So please, Luciana.
Thank you very much, Professor Laura Izarra, for the kind introduction. As Professor Laura has stated, this is a third of a series of 5 webinars on English for academic purposes for learning and teaching. And in addition to today's session, we at Aucani will be hosting 2 more sessions, one on July 24th on teaching academic writing in English online using Google Classroom, and the last one on July 31st on academic writing strategies for graduate students. Just like today's and the previous webinars, the upcoming 2 are all on Fridays at 2 p.m. The title of today's webinar is COCA Corpus Consultation for Academic Writing in English. And in this webinar, Professor Jamila Barton will discuss the benefits of using corpus linguistics methodology for improving second language writing. Participants will discover how corpus tools like the Corpus of Contemporary American English, COCA, can be consulted for improving vocabulary and grammar choices in academic writing in English. And as Professor Laura reminded us, the license for the English Corpora was acquired by the Department of Modern Languages of FIFILESTE, and the link to the English Corpora is available in the video description. I will now introduce our speaker. Professor Jamila Barton has over 19 years of experience in teaching English to speakers of other languages and 5 years experience with English language teacher development. She has a bachelor's degree in psychology and English from Tulane University, a CELTA RSA certificate, and an MA in TESOL from Seattle Pacific University. She was an ESL faculty in the Seattle Colleges District for 14 years and an English language fellow at the University of Jordan, Queen Rania Teachers Academy in Amman for 2 years. She also teaches English for art and design purposes at the Savannah College of Art and Design. Her current research interests include academic literacy, data-driven learning, and English language teacher development. Before I give the floor to Professor Barton, I would like to inform the audience that if you require a certificate of attendance, a link will be available on the YouTube video description at around half an hour into the talk. The slides will also be available at the end of the series on the Aucani website, and you'll receive an email from Aucani-Idiomas informing when the slides are available. You can also make questions via chat, and questions can be made in English or Portuguese. And please, it really helps the host if you submit your questions during the talk and not necessarily after the talk. So now, without further ado, Professor Jamila, thank you for being here, and take it away.
Okay, just give me 1 second to set everything up here. Always takes a minute. All right, are we seeing the screen okay?
It's not up yet. I think it's coming. Yes, it's coming up.
Okay, great. It's just a little slow on my end today. Okay, so hi everybody. Welcome back to Corpus consultation for academic writing in English. This is another Aucani webinar. And today we're going to talk about Corpus consultation for academic writing in English. I'm having a little trouble getting everything working here, so just give me a second. Why isn't this working now? Okay, that's working much better. Okay, so as I said, today we're going to talk about using Corpora for teaching and learning in second language writing. And this topic is actually very important to me because I teach at an English for Specific Purposes website or school where all of my students are trying to learn how to write for art and design purposes. And I don't have a background in art and design, so I use a lot of Corpus consultation to kind of teach them disciplinary writing in that field. So before we get started today, I'd like to just start with a little sort of poll question. So I want to use poll everywhere, just as we've been doing this whole time. If you're new, go ahead and go to pollev.com. and use my classroom tag. It's just my name, Jamila Barton, 197 to respond. And we can take up to 700 participants in that poll. So please feel free to participate if you like. And the question I'm asking here is, what words and phrases come to mind when I say corpus linguistics? So what do you know about corpus linguistics? And we'll see what people respond. Okay, somebody said something about grammar. I agree with that. Oh, senses of words, so sort of semantics and what the meaning is. Somebody said dictionaries. A lot of sort of second language dictionaries are based on Corpora. That's good. Research, there's lots of research about patterns and language patterns. Authentic use of language. I see some really, really great ideas, and maybe we have some experts in watching us today. Great. Frequency is an important issue for Corpora and for corpus linguistics because a lot of the language that we look at in corpus linguistics is based on frequency, and we'll talk more about that. So thank you so much for participating in our first poll. Let's just talk a little bit about our agenda today. And if you aren't sure what corpus linguistics is and how it can be used in the classroom, don't worry. By the end of this session, you'll have a pretty good idea of what corpus-driven research is and how it's contributed to what we know about language and writing. We'll also discuss the pedagogical approach to second language writing that comes out of corpus linguistics. Finally, I'll show you some examples of how EAP practitioners are using data-driven learning activities that are corpus-based to teach writing skills. So let's start with what corpus linguistics actually is. And so I have a quote here from Susan Conrad, and she describes corpus linguistics as an approach to research, and language research specifically, and teaching that makes use of computer-assisted analyses of language. So that contrasts with previous schools of grammar, because a lot of previous schools of grammar, like Chomsky's universal grammar, were largely based on intuitions by native speakers. So native speakers would look at language data and then say, this is what it means, and this is the pattern, right? Corpus-driven research actually uses computer tools to analyze and describe language from actual written and spoken language use. So corpus collections involve written texts and spoken transcribed texts, and they are used, quantitative statistics and qualitative analysis is used to determine the language patterns that occur frequently in the data. So corpus linguists actually assume that frequently occurring language should be taught because learners will most likely encounter it in real life contexts. So now let's talk a little bit about what a corpus is. A corpus is a set of naturally occurring written or spoken texts that have been systematically collected. And the collection is usually based on some form of a language variety, something that someone is interested in. For example, if I'm interested in the language choices and the rhetorical features of undergraduate student writing and English composition courses, I might collect student essays from multiple undergraduate composition classes and then use them in corpus-driven analysis. Corpus analysis tools can be used by teachers and students to quickly and accurately deliver statistics on frequency, so what are the most frequent words and phrases, range, so how many texts, how often is it found in the corpus, associations with other words and phrases, we call this collocation, and keenness, or how more likely is it to occur in this corpus based on or compared to other corpora, right? And we also use corpus tools to generate concordances. And a concordance is randomly selected examples from the corpus of a word or a phrase. And they don't show you the whole sentence, but they do show you about 50 characters before and after the word, so you can get an idea about the context of the word, right? So let's actually look at an example of from COCA. So you all have access to the corpus of contemporary American English. So I'm going to try to show you examples from COCA since you can use it freely. So this example I'm going to show you is from the word question. And what I did was I simply did a quick search for question. And then I want to show you the kind of information that you can get just from a quick search of a word. So here is an example here. This is the first part of my COCA search. And what you can see is that I have the word question, and then it gives me a graph of how it's used in different registers. So in academic English, it's used more frequently than in newspapers and magazines and fiction, but in spoken English, it's used the most frequently, right? It also shows me some collocates or collocations. These are associations that word has with other words. And if you notice here, it's often used with the noun answer, or interestingly, the noun Obama. And it's often used with the verbs ask, answer, raise, and pose, right? And then it shows you some examples of adjectives and adverbs that are commonly collocated with the word question. After you see this sort of general information about question, you can then see a concordance of question. With concordance lines, I can look for collocations before and after the word, and I can even search further and find out more about that collocation. So what do you notice about the word question from the COCA search? What are some common collocations after the noun? How about what verbs collocate with the noun? Do these patterns suggest anything about the meaning and the use? Second language writing teachers can use Corpora to identify commonly used linguistic features of a specific genre for instruction. And second language writers can use Corpora to check their phrases against what is commonly used in similar contexts by other writers. So let's see, what do you notice about the word question from COCA? Well, yes, that's right. A very, very common collocate of question is the preposition about. So that could be actually really important for a language learner who might not know which preposition to use after the word question. Somebody else said that good question is good is a common adjective that collocates before question. So that might also be useful for a language learner who is writing and trying to use question in a sort of unmarked way that native speakers would use it. Okay, looks good. So let's go on. And we've talked, I skipped one. We talked a little bit about how we use Corpora. But I also want to talk about different types of Corpora, because depending on what you want your students to be able to do, you might choose different types of Corpora as a part of your teaching. So different types of Corpora represent different language varieties, disciplines, and genres. Depending on the purpose for the collection of the text, Corpora will be different sizes. So general Corpora tend to be quite large because they represent larger domains and registers. So a domain is an area, could be a discipline, could be a field, could be a number of fields. It depends on the definition of the Corpora. And it could also have a number of registers. So an example of a register would be academic register or everyday register. So we use different language choices in academic circles than we do in everyday situations. Corpora can also be organized by genre or text type. So, for example, COCA represents all American English from the 1990s to the present, and it contains both written and spoken data or registers for both academic and everyday registers. And it also has a number of text types. So it includes newspapers, academic journals, magazine articles, as well as conversation and other spoken forms of texts. So when we say register, we mean that it refers to a situationally defined language use within a setting. And genres, just to be clear about the difference between the two, refers to a specific type of text a communicative text within that setting. So that's a general corpora. Specialized corpora are smaller collections of written and or transcribed spoken texts that are limited either to a specific domain or discipline, a specific register, or a specific text type or genre. So the only other corpora I'll talk about right now is comparable or parallel corpus. This might be useful with lower level proficiency second language writers because it provides either similar texts in more than one language or exactly translated texts in multiple languages. For example, I believe the suite of English corpora that COCA belongs to actually has a parallel Portuguese-English corpora attached to it that you can explore, that is where the texts themselves have been translated from Portuguese to English and from English to Portuguese. So lower level students can actually compare the differences. Okay, so let's talk about what we've learned from corpus-driven research at this point, because there's some very important assumptions that corpus-driven research is based on because of what they've found in the years before. So one assumption that corpus-driven research makes is that manual analysis of register and genres can be inaccurate because they're largely based on researcher intuition. And literacy practices in specific disciplines and fields can be very entrenched and very difficult to explain and analyze without some sort of objective empirical tool for analysis. And a corpus linguist would say that corpus analysis allows for this more objective empirical tool for studying vocabulary, phraseological patterns, grammatical patterns, and rhetorical features, because it gives us statistics about the most frequent items and how they are used. So corpus-driven research has taught us a lot about language. One of the things that we've learned because of corpus linguistics is that language choices are different depending on what domain you're in, or what register you're using, or what genre you're using. My favorite example of this is with academic and everyday registers. We actually use quite different language when we're talking for academic circles versus when we're talking in our everyday homes with our family and friends. So this is something that came from corpus-driven research. Another thing that it came from this research is this idea of formulaic expressions. So John Sinclair, who is very huge in starting the sort of corpus-driven research, started to notice when he was doing his Collins-Cobill dictionary that language users have a number of formulaic phrases that they just use. They're fixed phrases when they use them directly, right? So it's almost like they have their own sort of entry in our mind, right? And other researchers have found that more than 50% of written discourse and spoken discourse is formulaic. So it's worth it for us to know these phrases and to teach our students these phrases so that they can automatically use them without having to try to put things together word by word, right? So this is one of the biggest pieces that has come from corpus research, is this idea of phraseology or formulaic phrases that students just need to know, and that these phrases are actually quite specific, and they serve special functions in different discourse communities and in different genres. So not only do we need to know formulaic expressions, but we also need to know them specifically for the genres and the registers that we're trying to write for. Another thing that they've found is that language learners actually struggle a lot with formulaic expressions. And so because they don't get enough input from a variety of contexts, and this actually affects their fluency in writing. So a lot of the odd and strange things that second language writers say in their writing are really down to the fact that they don't know formulaic phrases and collocations, and they make mistakes with odd word choice and awkward phrases. Okay, time for a poll. Let's see if you can match the best corpus. So I talked about a number of different types of corpora to use with second language writers in engineering who are trying to learn how to write reports. Can you guess which corpus would be best for these students? So I'll just remind you about some of the different types. So a general corpus provides a number of different domains and registers and genres. A specialized corpus is specialized to either one domain or one register or one genre. And a monitor corpus is one that collects information about a domain, a register, or a genre over time. And a parallel corpus would be one that is used, that's translated, right, into multiple languages so that you can compare what someone would say in Portuguese versus what someone would say in English. Yeah. So let's see what everybody is saying here. It looks like my trick question was too easy because most of you are saying B, and I agree. If you are doing something that is very specific, like engineering, and you're using a very specific type of genre, like report writing, then it's probably better to have a specialized corpus. Now, one thing is you could create your own corpus by collecting information from your students and from the field, but you can also use larger corpora like COCA and limit your search to a certain section, right? So one of the nice things about COCA is that you can limit your search to academic articles only in engineering, for example. Yeah. So let's go on. So there are a number of ways that corpora can be used in the classroom. And McHenry and Chow talk about a number of different ways that you can use them. More recently, dictionaries and grammar books have been based on corpora, especially for second language learners. And two good examples of this is the Collins-Cobill Dictionary, which John Sinclair worked on in the 1990s and is now dictionary that you can buy at an intermediate and advanced level that is based on corpus research. And so it gives more information than just the meaning, but also collocates and how it's used and what registers. So you can get a lot of information from this dictionary this way. Another example of a corpus-based grammar book would be the Longman Student Grammar of Spoken and Written English. And that is organized based on corpora that have been examined. And that's done by Biber and Conrad and Leach. So those are two very good books that if you're looking for corpus-based insights into language, that can give you quite a number of insights into language. The second way that corpora are used is directly in the classroom. So that's when teachers develop classroom activities using corpora, either paper-based activities or activities where the students go online themselves and search, a corpus. And the final way that corpora are used in the classroom is they can be used to research new language varieties for new classroom insights into second language writing. So this is specifically just for teachers. So if I'm teaching a new course in art and design, and most of my students are in film and TV, I might want to collect some articles just in film and TV and do a little analysis myself so that I can help my students with their writing. Okay, so I want to talk about the second one that McHenry and Chow talk about, which is direct use of corpora in the classroom. And we actually have a name for this as a pedagogical approach. We call this data-driven learning, or DDL for short. And this was originally attributed to Tim Johns in the 1990s at the University of Birmingham. And Johns used concordance printouts from the Cobill Dictionary in an elective for English for specific purposes, a course for international graduate students. And he taught the students how to develop their own questions and then search for those questions in the corpus, and then observe what's happening with the language patterns and make inferences about language use in that particular corpus. And he defines this approach as a data-driven learning, which he sees as an alternative to traditional rules-based approach to language learning. So normally when we teach vocabulary and grammar, we tell the students what the meaning is, and then we have them practice, right? we present the information, and then we have them do a controlled practice, and then we have them do an open practice. But the students aren't really having to develop their own ideas about anything. They're just taking the information in because they believe us, right? So this is not ideal. Actually, it's very helpful for students in their own learning to have a more inductive learning experience where they actually go and look at information themselves and make up their own rules with your guidance, right? So obviously teachers have to guide students in this practice. So speaking of how you would guide students in a pedagogical practice for DDL, there's sort of a standard way to build a task around DDL learning with a corpus that you're using. And basically what you would do is you would guide learners in using whatever corpus tool you're using, whether it's COCA or something else, to analyze features for those language patterns and make conclusions, right? So the first thing you'd want them to do is come up with a question. And if you're dealing with a class that has never done this before, probably you would design the question and then show them how to search, and then observe the examples and help them decide what the patterns are so that they can make conclusions about that kind of language. Okay, so data-driven learning has not been fully and wholly accepted in the community of second language writing research. There's some proponents who really feel very strongly about the use of data-driven learning as a way for to make classrooms more learner-centered and make students more autonomous in their learning. Because, student writers, when they leave us, they have to know how to write, and they have to have strategies for learning this kind of information on their own. So one of the biggest advantages of teaching with corpus-based activities is that you're actually preparing the student for using language and checking their own language outside of EAP and ESL, right? So as I said, though, there are some criticisms of this approach. And one of the biggest criticisms is that when you use concordance lines, it's really decontextualized. So you can't really, it's kind of separated from the genre itself. So a lot of people feel that data-driven learning is not helpful for developing genre knowledge. But I'm going to show you some activities that would question that assumption that data-driven learning can't be used to learn genre. Teachers have been very reluctant to adopt these methods, obviously, because in the past, teacher education programs have not studied corpus linguistic methods. And that's changed a lot. For example, when I did my master's, I never heard about corpus linguistics, but when I did my PhD, I actually took a class. So things change over time. The other thing is that a lot of teachers complain that they don't really have access to easy to use Corpora and Corpus tools. That's also changing. I'm going to show you some Corpora that you can use that are quite easy, including COCA, right? So once you've learned how to use COCA, it's very easy to use. And then also sometimes teachers complain that it takes up a lot of class time. That is true, right? So when you allow students to look at data, look at language, and think about and talk about what that means and how to use it, that does take more time than just telling them. But it's useful, and you don't have to wholesale adopt it as your only methodology for teaching, of course, right? And then the final thing is that there's been a lot of concern about whether or not you can use Corpora for second language writers with lower proficiency. Because the concordances can be a little bit overwhelming because it's so much text. And what I would say to that is that a lot of lower proficiency second language writers can use Corpora if the teacher is willing to kind of limit the number of examples that concordance examples that are given, and maybe even choose only the simple and easy ones. Another way to handle that is to use a parallel corpus where the students can then see it in their language and then also in English. So there's lots of ways that you can adapt data-driven learning as a pedagogical approach for lower proficiency learners. So I also want to talk about some other issues with data-driven learning as pedagogy. So the first thing I want to talk about is whether or not to use this very teacher-controlled deductive tasks where you guide the students through activities that are very set up for you to be the guide, versus this sort of hard DDL, which is where you give them the activity and they collaborate together to discover the language themselves. So obviously the issue here is whether or not students are capable of using the tools. So there's been a lot of discussion in the research about how much teacher mediation and how much training students need to use these kinds of tools. And Bolton, I think it was 2015, he actually studied this. He did a very set sort of training for his low proficiency students, and then allowed them to do self-discovery tasks, and it worked just fine for them. And so he would say that when you want to start this with lower level students, you might start with paper-based activities that you create from COCA or from another corpus, and then guide them through a couple of times, and then give them more and more autonomy that every time you do the activity, right? So that's one way to kind of make it easier for them. Another thing that you can do is you can help students by using either a top-down or a bottom-up approach. So Flowerdew actually talks a lot about this, Lynn Flowerdew. And what she says is that a top-down approach to second language reading and writing would first focus on genre and genre analysis. And that's where they're actually looking at texts and highlighting different parts of the text to explain, like, what do you do first? What are the rhetorical features? That kind of thing. And then using corpus-based activities to examine the linguistic choices that are used to realize those genre features. So that would be a top-down approach to teaching writing using DDL. A bottom-up approach to teaching writing using DDL would actually look at the features first, and then look at the genre and the role and the functions in the text. So those are two different ways of doing it. And we've already talked about simplifying concordance lines for L2 writers with lower proficiency. A lot of corpus linguists discourage changing the examples themselves, because then you're giving students a false sense about what the actual language patterns actually are. But you, like I said, you could call the examples and give just 5 to 7 examples instead of 10 to 15, right? And the other thing is you can choose easier examples yourself to make things easier for students. So what does the research say about data-driven learning pedagogical approaches to language learning? Has it been positive? So actually, there's been some studies. It's still a relatively new field, and so there's not as much research as we would like to see to feel confident that this is a good approach. But there is, the studies that there are out there really have found really positive outcomes, and especially related to teaching high-frequency vocabulary and formulaic phrases, and also to raising awareness about the meaning of words and phrases and grammatical expressions, and also moves in a genre. So one of the things that research has found for data-driven learning is that a lot of the language patterns that can be examined in corpus research are not covered in textbooks. So one thing that's happening is that corpus-based research is finding all of this stuff about language patterns, but it's not translating to the materials that EAP teachers have available to them. So actually using data-driven learning in the classroom can really help you address issues that are not currently being addressed in the material that you have. Okay, time for another poll. I've been talking for a while. So which of these activities would be the most appropriate for data-driven learning classroom activities for second language writing? What do you think? This is an opinion question. There's no right answer here. So what do you think about this? Do you think that data-driven learning would be the most appropriate for learning vocabulary? Do you think that it would be the most appropriate for learning formulaic expressions? How about grammar? Is this a good tool to teach grammar? And the final one, how about for learning rhetorical features of a genre? What's your opinion? So a lot of people like this idea of learning formulaic phrases using corpora. I agree with that, especially because a lot of English as a second language material and textbooks doesn't really cover this kind of information. So if you don't have it in the book, then you have to get it from somewhere. Otherwise, students don't know how to write. The second most popular here is learning vocabulary. I would definitely agree with that. I guess enough people have changed their mind that grammar would also be good. Yeah, I think part of the reason why there is sort of discussion about whether grammar and vocabulary are sort of equal here is because when you're doing corpus-based activities, grammar and vocabulary are so linked that you can't really separate them. And then I noticed that a lot of you feel like it would be very difficult to teach rhetorical features of a genre. That's actually very true. The current tools that we have available to us from the corpus tools, computer-based corpus tools, do not have an easy way to search for moves and stages and rhetorical features of a genre. I imagine that is coming soon. There's actually a couple of free tools now that I think if you really want to just analyze text this way, it's quite easy. But this is something I think that is coming. It hasn't come yet, right? Good. Let's go on. So in this next part, what I'm going to do is I'm going to describe for you a number of corpus-based data-driven learning activities for teaching second language writing. And all of these come from articles that I've read over time, and I think they're really good examples of how you can use corpus activities to teach second language writing. So at the end here of my presentation, I've listed all of the articles here in the reference section. So if you want to go and look and learn more about that activity, you're welcome. So the first activity I'm going to talk about is actually Mark Davies. He is the professor that manages COCA at Brigham Young University. And he also has a website where he's taken the 60,000 of the most frequent words, academic vocabulary words, and you can go and look at a profile of any one of those words and use them with your students. That website also has the ability to take your text, any text that you want to upload to that site, and it will analyze it for frequent academic and technical vocabulary from comparing it to COCA itself. And so this could be really useful if you're preparing to teach a model for reading or for writing. Yeah. So let's actually go ahead and look at that activity here. So this is the activity that I was just talking about, where you use the website wordandphrase.info for academic vocabulary. And the only teacher preparation here is that you need to decide what sample text that you're going to have your students read, or what model for writing that you're going to have your students read. And then you would analyze it beforehand so that you know what are the most frequent academic words and phrases that the students would need to know for that text, right? And then what you would do is you would have the students do kind of a discovery activity, and you could do this individually or you could do this as a collaborative activity. And what the example I looked at, Davies 2015, what he did was he did it for aviation English, and he took a sentence like this one here: the initial impact with the seawall occurred at 11:27 p.m. And he asks the students to analyze the word impact, right? So impact is actually one of the academic vocabulary words that appear in COCA. It's one of the 60,000 most frequent words in academic language, right? So you would search for impact in this word and phrase.info and ask the students to look for the part of speech that impact has in the sample text. And also look for a definition that most closely matches the context in the text. And then look at some of the concordances and try to guess about collocations, like adjective collocations and other language patterns, right? So you could have them do this very simple activity to help them learn how to raise awareness about how academic vocabulary is used in writing that they're familiar with, in texts that they're reading, and in models that they're going to use for writing. Okay, the next activity I want to talk about is Creswell 2007. And this activity uses logical connectors like nevertheless, although, moreover, right? And what Creswell did was with his students, he looked at the student writing that he received from them, and he looked for mistakes. And any logical connectors that were misused or overused or underused, he created a list of 27 logical connectors. And then he created an activity to raise students' awareness of how those connectors should actually be used in writing. So he had, one of the things that he did to limit the amount of, information that students were looking at is he asked the students to limit COCA, which is the big general corpus, just to one section, which is the academic articles section. And so they were only looking at academic articles so they could get information for academic writing. And the activity was that groups received a set of sentences that had been with connectors that had been misused, underlined. And then the groups were then to use COCA to answer questions about those connectors and then correct the errors if they, as they looked at concordance lines. So that's another example of an activity. Another example of activity is a little bit more, individual, and this is something that students would do during the revision process after you've given them feedback. And this actually is part of the Lexitutor website that you can find online that Cobb's created. And what he has them do is he'll take a piece of writing that a student has done and give feedback to the student. But as a part of the feedback that he gives, he underlines common ESL errors. So on the Lexitutor website, they have a set of common errors that second language writers make. And for each error, there's a link to concordances for that error and then ways to fix your error, right? So instead of telling the student what they did wrong, he asks the student to go to that link and then fix the sentence themselves using the Corpus tool. So what I like about this activity is it's very, very controlled. So the student is just looking at one phrase in their writing, and then they're going to one specific place, and they're looking at concordances just that are related to that mistake, and then they have to fix their writing. Right? So it's very immediate and it's very controlled, and it would work with lower level students. Okay, let's look at another example. So this one is by Joel Block, and he he did a little bit more teacher preparation work. So if you're the kind of person who really likes to play around with Corpora, this is your kind of activity because you need to do a little front work here in order to make this work. So what he did was he used COCA to choose a number of reporting verbs that are used in research papers, academic articles again. And then he did concordance searches for those reporting verbs and created a bank of sentences to use as concordances for the students to read and classify and develop an understanding of how reporting verbs work in academic writing. So the reason why this is important is because citation practice is very important in research writing. So, and one thing that non-native speakers might lack that native speakers sort of understand is how these different reporting verbs change the claim that we're making. So, and they also, how these reporting verbs actually link back to the sources that we are using as well. So, reporting verbs really do establish the credibility of the student writer and also the claims that they're making. So knowing how to use reporting verbs is really important. And Corpora can really give students really great examples and ideas about which reporting verbs to use for the kinds of claims that they might want to make. Okay, let's look at another example. So in this example, Jones and Hayward, 2004, the teachers actually identified formulaic phrases that they wanted to teach their students. And then they selected extracts from the corpus and then removed the phrases so that the students would have to fill in the gaps as an exercise. So you can do this by using concordances again. So when you search in COCA and you get a set of concordance lines, you can click on any one of those lines and it will give you a very short paragraph where that phrase occurs. So that's what they did, was they went in and they took out a number of extracts from the corpus. And again, it's great because it's actual real language use. And then they just took out the phrase for sort of a fill in the blank type of exercise. And this is really great if you've already taught how to use formulaic phrases, and then you just want to test or assess students in how much they understand about the meaning differences between formulaic phrases. So the formulaic phrases that they used here, if you look here in their exercise, were things like, this view is confirmed by, or according to the survey carried out by, right? So the student would have to read this very short excerpt from the corpus and then fill in the blanks according to what's in the text box here. Okay, so let's look at another activity that you might use. And this is our last one for today, and then we'll do a poll. So in this activity, this is sort of a genre-based analysis activity that you can do specifically for moves. So a move is a rhetorical strategy or a stage in a genre. So you could take a number of sentences from different moves that all have the same kind of language, right? And then you can create this kind of activity where you have, this one is contrasting the keyword project and the keyword will, right? And there's, I think the first one has about 15 concordance lines, but I only showed you 5 here. And then the second one also has about 15 concordance lines, but there's only 4 shown here. And then what you would do is you would give this, these concordances to students and ask them to think about genre-based questions. So genre specific questions like, who is the author of these sentences? And who is the audience? Can you figure that out from the language that's here? And what's the purpose for writing? And then what rhetorical effect is achieved by the highlighted words, right? So reading through the concordances, can you tell what the purpose of this word is in those sentences? And then are there other ways for the author to achieve the same effect? So corpus-based activities can be used to look at linguistic features for genre activities. Now, it's more difficult to use corpus-based activities to actually analyze genre. And so I would actually recommend genre pedagogy for analyzing moves and actual text level information. But once you're ready to look at linguistic features, corpus-based activities are really great for that. Okay, so let's do a little poll question here. What other activities can you think of to support learners in developing knowledge about vocabulary, formulaic phrases, and linguistic features of genres for second language writing? So I've given you a couple of different activities that you can use where students can raise awareness. They can explore corpora and raise their own awareness of the meanings and the collocations for different phrases and words. I also gave you some examples of linguistic features that you can examine. For example, reporting verbs and also formulaic expressions that are used quite often in moves and within genres. So let's see if you can think of other activities. So looking at or comparing different corpora and reporting so that would be a very good activity. So if you wanted to compare a text like a magazine article versus an academic article, the type of language that's used in magazine articles versus the type of language that's used in academic articles, you could compare in COCA these two different kinds of language, or these two different registers, right? Connect activities, I'm not really sure. Oh, keyword analysis. So I didn't talk about keyword analysis because that's very difficult to do in COCA. You really need other corpus tools to do keyword analysis. But keyword analysis is where you compare a language feature in your target corpus. So let's say I want to know about academic articles in philosophy. So I would have a target corpus of philosophy academic articles, and then the whole COCA, and I would compare the types of vocabulary that are most frequent in the corpus for philosophy academic articles and the types of vocabulary in COCA. And in order to figure out what words are unusually frequent or unusually infrequent in the philosophy for academic articles corpus, right? So that could tell me about words that I need to teach for my students, right? So comparing two varieties of language in English, yes. Two or more keywords from the text, very good. Real life conversation, absolutely. So I didn't give any spoken examples, but you can absolutely use this for real life conversation. Good, so we have lots of ideas here. So I have one more thing I want to talk about, and then I'll take some questions. So one thing, when you're planning DDL activities or data-driven learning activities in your own classroom, you kind of want to have some criteria for evaluating those activities. So here I have some questions here. This is from Fergenal's book, 2018. He writes a book about corpus linguistics for teachers, and he gives a lot of activities in that book. So if you really are interested in this topic and you want to try this out, that's a very helpful book for learning how to teach with DDL. So some things to think about when you are planning your activities. The first one is, does the corpus materials that you are using fit the level of language and the needs that the students have? The second thing is the linguistic feature you're trying to teach, are you finding enough examples in the corpus to actually use it to teach it, right? The other thing is, data-driven learning activities don't work very well unless you're really focusing the learner's attention on the form and on the forms that you want them to notice. So you really have to think about how you're going to design the activity so that students are really focusing on what you want them to focus on. Data-driven learning activities are, by definition in the classroom, collaborative. It's very helpful for students if they're doing it together. Now, once they start doing it on their own, they might be alone, but definitely for mediation, peer mediation is very important here. And then also, what kind of feedback are you giving students about the activity itself? So if they're doing something on their own, are you leaving them afterwards to figure out whether or not the conclusions that they drew about the language patterns are correct, right, by themselves? Or are you telling them and helping them guide them if they have some ideas that are not quite right about, words and phrases? Right. And then the last thing is, does the activity develop use of language learning strategies? So the ones in particular that corpus-based DDL activities really develop are research skills, right? Critical thinking skills and analysis skills, and also autonomy, right? So a lot of the students, for example, in my classes, I teach the highest level art and design writing classes in my school. And a lot of my students, as soon as they leave me, they have to go and write their master's theses by themselves, without any help. So do they know how to do that? Can they figure out whether or not a word or a phrase that they're using is a problem in their sentences, right? So part of the reason I teach DDL is because it really helps students know how to use language on their own, because they're not going to have me when they leave my class, right? Okay. So here are some of the references that I used for this presentation. All of the articles all of the examples of DDL activities come from articles, so you can find them in this list here when these are posted. Another useful thing for you to keep in mind is that there are other corpora that are very helpful, and I've only given 3 here, because all of these are free. So the Corpus for Contemporary American English is the one that you have available to you through University of Sao Paulo. And then there are 2 more that I think are really useful for academic English, which is the Michigan Corpus of Upper Level Student Papers, which is a corpus of student papers in undergraduate and graduate disciplines at the University of Michigan. So you can actually search all of these papers because because all of the students gave permission. So you can take whole excerpts. You can search by a specific discipline. You can search by a specific paper topic or type. And then they also have, University of Michigan also has a corpus of academic spoken English. So this comes from office, so faculty talking to students at office hours, general small talk that happens in departments. So there's lots of transcribed spoken transcripts here for analysis for spoken English. And then if you are somebody who really likes to play around with the computer and you want to try more corpus analysis on your own, there are some really great free corpus analysis tools. One of the best ones, I think, is Lawrence Anthony's AntConc, which actually, if you have any group of texts that you want to analyze, you could download this AntConc, it's free, and then upload the text to that software, and it will analyze it. You can look for phrases, it will give you frequency lists, you can develop concordances, and it will give you a lot of information about words and phrases. So that's a really useful one. So if you're somebody who would like to play around with your own specialized corpus of text for your students, that would be a great way to do that. And then the Lexitutor that I talked about in the activity that Cobb put together is here, if you want to use that. Tim Johns also developed a set of little activities that you could do with your students called Kibitzers. And Mike Husband, My Case from the University of Michigan also has a set that you can go to and get started with prepackaged corpus activities. And then the other thing I have linked here is to the wordandphrase.info, which is based on COCA, but allows you to analyze academic texts. Yeah. Okay, so I'm ready for questions, and I have, while I'm taking questions, please go ahead and evaluate the webinar for me so that I know what you thought about it. Okay, ready for questions.
Thank you, Jamila, for this amazing talk. Such a wealth of materials. I'm certain everyone will be able to explore all the links that you have referred us to, and they'll find much more information in the references. So thank you so much. The first question we had is about corpora in other languages other than English. So I can respond to that. And if you let me just do the commercial for the University of São Paulo, we have a corpus at the University of São Paulo called COMET, Corpus Multilingüe para Ensino, Pesquisa e Tradução. It's a freely available corpora. It's specialized. So we have legal language, engineering, and several other specialized fields. And all you have to do is just Google COMET FEFELESH, and you'll probably get there to the website. What we will do also is we will probably just make a list of the corpora in Portuguese and then add them to the description of the video, because people will probably be interested in Portuguese as well. Other corpora based on Portuguese, we have Corpus Brasileiro, which is a FAPESP-funded project with a Catholic university, and the website is corpusbrasileiro.pucusp.br. There's also corpusdoportugues.org, also Mark Davis, right, for the English corpora. He has a Corpus do Português historical corpora as well, and many other periods. So that's online as well. We have Compara Corpus, which is translated literature in several Portuguese language from various countries and English from various countries. So that's the Compara Corpus, which is part of the Linguateca corpus. So if you go to linguateca.pt, you will find a lot of corpora there as well. Portuguese from Brazil, Portuguese from Portugal, and so on. And there's also a big corpus called LACIO Web, Corpus do Português do Brasil, e Implementação de Ferramentas para Análise Linguística, which is a project that was carried out by NUCI at USP and FEFELESH as well. They're all available online, and we'll add them to the description. Obviously, we have corpora. There are corpora in many other languages. There are Chinese corpora, Japanese corpora. I invite everyone to just go online and search for them. You'll find French, Portuguese. You have many parallel and comparable corpora as well. So translated and both fields. So online, you will find a lot of materials. If there's anything you wanted to add to that, Jamila?
Yeah, no, you said it the best. I think if you are really interested in studying other languages, there is something out there for you, I promise. You just have to look for it.
Right. So the first question, let's go to I have several questions here. So I'll start the Q&As. How do you go about using your own students' writing to improve their writing during a writing course?
So with the corpus activities? Yeah. Okay, so
and this is related
the first thing
to what kind of software you use.
Right. Okay, that's good to know. So actually, I create my own so whenever I have my students do writing and I know I'm going to do a corpus activity with them, I actually create my own little corpus of their writing. And then I love ANCONC. So I use ANCONC quite frequently. So what I just described, when you take your students' writing and you create its own corpus, that's what's called a learner corpus. And you can analyze that for, all kinds of different linguistic features. So I can tag certain features as errors as I give them feedback. And then when I put it all in a corpus, I can search for those features and figure out which errors are the most frequent, right? And that's actually relatively easy to do in ANCONC. And and using Lawrence Anthony's free tools for corpus analysis. So I would really recommend, if you would like to analyze your students' writing for mistakes, that you learn how to use NCONC. And it took me one afternoon to learn it. It's super easy, and it doesn't take any time to download it. And if you're reading your students' writing already to give them feedback, you can tag certain features as you read, and then throw it all in a corpus and see what comes up as most frequent errors.
Mm-hmm. Great. I'll just like to remind the audience that because corpus linguistics has been a field of research at the University of São Paulo for 20 years, there are many dissertations and theses which are freely available online in Banco de Teses da USP, which address both COCA and many other corpora and also NCONC. And you can also use the tutorials on Lawrence Anthony's website to learn how to use NCONC. And as Jamila said, it's really easy and straightforward to use. Okay. So the next question, this is an interesting one. Will using COCA in your writing make students incur in plagiarism?
You know, I always get somebody that asks me that when I talk about corpus linguistics. So that question comes from this idea that all of our writing is unique and original. And the truth is that even native speakers use formulaic phrases and expressions all the time. And when I'm writing for an article, I actually look at other articles to figure out what kind of words and phrases I should be using, right? And that's what we want our students to do as well. So actually, them using fixed phrases in a way that is appropriate for that discipline or for that field is actually what we want for them. And COCA is actually it's stripped of, a lot of the examples in COCA are stripped of citation, like actual citations and things like that. So there isn't really a way for the student to plagiarize in the sense of borrowing other people's ideas for their own, right? So I don't think, I think that there is, that's actually a very good question. But I do think that corpus, COCA can't really be used to plagiarize in the sense that you're taking somebody else's ideas and using them for your own, but it can be used to use formulaic phrases and words that are more appropriate for the field or register that you're writing for. I hope that answers that.
Right. This is another question by a learner. And Camila Aparecida is asking, do you recommend we create our own bank of phrases and collocations while we are reading papers in our field?
That's a great idea. In fact, there's a really great article by one of the professors I work with at Georgia State University, Dr. Viviana Cortez, and she actually uses students' own personally created corpora in her classroom with her students. So it's a graduate writing class, and she has the students create their own corpora of academic articles with examples of things that they can say in their own writing. So they're actually not just reading the academic articles, but also analyzing it for phrases and moves and things that they can use in their own writing.
Right. Another question is about the use of authentic language. Why is authentic language so important for teaching English or for learning a foreign language? And how would you compare using corpora, such as COCA, to using dictionaries?
They're very close. I mean, both use of corpora and use of reference material, you use them for the same reason. It's a tool for you to use the best and most appropriate word or phrase, right? But a lot of native speaking dictionaries are based on native speaker intuition. They're not, not nowadays. Nowadays, learner dictionaries are based on corpora. So you have that as an option. But there is a difference between looking up sort of a very static, fixed dictionary definition with a couple of examples that are not related to your field versus looking up a bunch of examples from your field, from the register that you're trying to write, from the genre, and then kind of being able to notice the collocations and also the types of meanings that creates. You have a lot more information at your hand when you use a corpus than when you use a dictionary.
Right. This is also in the line of authentic language. How do we find out the materials we use as students is corpus-based or authentic?
Well, so if you're using a corpus, there's usually any corpus that you use online is going to have some, page that is about that corpus, and it will tell you where they get the information from. COCA actually has a whole page of the genres that they use, where they get the information from, and what year it comes from. So COCA actually has very specific information about where the information is coming from. And I'm glad you asked that question, because part of what makes use of corpora effective in the classroom is when you take the time to pick the best corpus to use, right? So all of COCA information is natural, authentic, real-life language use. It's not made-up examples at all, right? Other corpuses, you would have to go and look and see what their collection methods were.
Okay, and because we're running out of time, this is our last question. And it's also from the point of view of students. How can students with a basic level of English benefit from using corpora?
Teacher mediation is really important if you want to use this with your lower level students. You really need to do a lot of preparation work at the beginning. And then, so some things I do when I'm using corpora with lower level students is I will do the analysis myself. We're using a huge list of concordances. And then as I go through, I'll pick concordance lines that I think they can read. Right? And a really good rule of thumb for lower level proficiency students is to not have more than 7 concordance lines. So 5 to 7 there's some research about this. 5 to 7 concordance lines is appropriate for a lower level student. 10 to 15 is appropriate for an advanced student. Okay? So you really need to, what I would be very careful about is don't change the concordance lines. Because if you change the concordance lines, then you're changing the patterns that they should be noticing. So don't change anything, but you can pick, more appropriate leveled lines for your students.
Right. Okay. So Jamila, thank you so much for this amazing talk and for answering so many questions. We have reached the end of the session. Therefore, I would like to thank Professor Valmorticoli from Aucani, who's a provost for international cooperation, for supporting this program, and the Department of State and the Regional English Language Office team in Brasilia and Sao Paulo. And of course, a special thanks to Jamila for another amazing talk. We have 2 others that are upcoming. On July 24th, Jamila will be talking about teaching academic writing in English online using Google Classroom. And on July 31st, we'll be talking about academic writing strategies for graduate students. And just like today, the next webinars will be on Fridays and at 2 p.m. as well. So I'd like to thank all the attendees. We had almost 500 people attending today from all over the USP community and campi, and also from outside the university. And these webinars will be available at the Aucani channel on YouTube. So thank you very much. And Jamila, see you in a couple of minutes.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.